Before we begin, let me ask you this. Have you ever loved someone before you even understood why? If you're drawn to stories that unfold slowly, quietly, and leave something lingering in your chest, give this video a like, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Now, let me tell you a story. I didn't cry at my wedding. Not because I didn't want to, but because the tears had dried somewhere between the fitting room and the aisle, buried beneath silk and obligation. The ballroom at Rose Hill Hall was beautiful in the kind of way that made you feel small. Golden chandeliers dangled like frozen suns. The walls whispered with old money, soft violins echoing through the marble. I stood beneath the arch, hands wrapped tightly around the bouquet I had arranged myself. White camellias, baby's breath, and one single lavender sprig my mother once said meant devotion in silence. No one noticed that the lace of my gown was hand-sewn, that I had bled for every stitch. No one noticed that I was shaking. Elias Thorne didn't look at me when I walked down the aisle. He didn't smile, didn't offer his arm. Just stood there in a midnight black suit, eyes fixed ahead like he was sealing a deal, not marrying a stranger. He was every bit the man the world said he was. Sharp-jawed, unreadable, more myth than flesh. A man who built a tech empire before he turned 35 and destroyed 3 competitors before breakfast. And now, he was my husband. The vows were short, efficient. The officiant barely had time to clear his throat before Elias slipped the ring onto my finger. It was heavier than I expected. Cold, like it had been waiting in ice. "I do," I whispered, voice nearly lost under the weight of the chandeliers. "I will," Elias said, quiet but firm. And that was it. No kiss, just the sound of polite applause, and the eyes of people who were all too relieved it wasn't them standing in my place. I excused myself before the reception. The dress was tight at the waist, and I couldn't breathe. My room was quiet, dimly lit, the scent of old rose perfume lingering in the wardrobe. I sat at the edge of the velvet chaise, unlacing the bodice with trembling hands. That's when I found it, tucked inside the lining of the dress, beneath the silk near my ribs, a folded piece of yellowed paper. A letter, handwritten, the loops of the pen unmistakable. My mother's. If you're reading this, it means I wasn't strong enough to tell you face to face. But my darling girl, if there comes a day when you must trade your heart for someone else's survival, do it with your head held high. Your father once owed a man named Thorne a debt too heavy for words. You were never meant to pay it, but I know you will try anyway. Remember this. Forgiveness is how we keep our hearts from turning to stone. I held the letter to my chest. The fabric of the dress felt tighter now. Not because it had changed, but because I had. Suddenly I wasn't just a daughter, or a bride. I was the bridge between 2 families, one burdened by guilt, the other by grief. I didn't understand everything in that letter, but I understood enough. This wasn't just a transaction. This marriage was a reckoning. When I emerged from the room, the hallway was nearly empty. Only Elias stood at the far end, hands in his pockets, staring out the arched window at the falling dusk. The last of the sunlight hit his profile, high cheekbones, a jawline chiseled by time and temperament. He turned slightly when he heard my footsteps. "You're ready?" he asked, voice low. "Yes," I replied. It wasn't a lie. It wasn't the truth either. But it was enough to move forward. The car ride to Montgrove House was silent. Outside, Manhattan blurred by in streaks of gold and blue. Inside, the air was filled with quiet expectations and the faint scent of Elias's cologne, cedarwood and winter rain. He didn't look at me. Not once. But when the car turned off the main road, gravel crunching beneath the wheels, I felt him shift. Just slightly. Like he too was bracing for something. The estate was vast, old world, The kind of place built not to impress, but to endure. Columns of gray stone. Iron gates. A house with too many windows and too few lights on. When I stepped inside, the first thing I noticed was the silence. Not peaceful. Hollow. A place haunted by people who never spoke what needed to be said. A maid showed me to my room, separate from his. Of course. The bed was too large, the curtains too heavy. On the side table was a single vase of camellias, white, like the ones I had picked for the wedding. Had he chosen them? I didn't know. I sat on the edge of the bed, pulled the letter from my bodice, and read it again under the soft yellow lamp. My mother's handwriting, steady despite all the years and pain, ended with one last line I hadn't seen before. Whatever he did, whatever your father did, you are not their debt. But I was. I had chosen to be. And now I was married to a man whose eyes wouldn't meet mine, whose past was tied to mine by chains I hadn't forged, but now had to carry. I stared at the door. He was somewhere beyond it, in another wing, in another world. And yet, for the first time that day, I didn't feel alone. I felt suspended between what was and what might be, between ghosts. Montgrove House had the kind of silence that wasn't just absence of noise. It had weight, like a cathedral after midnight, or a library full of books no one dared to touch. For the first 3 days, Elias and I barely crossed paths. He rose before dawn, left before breakfast, and returned after dark. I often heard the low hum of his car in the gravel drive, the echo of his shoes on the marble, but never his voice. He left the house like he didn't live in it, and when he returned, he moved through it like a ghost returning to a mausoleum. I ate most of my meals alone, at a long dining table that could seat 20. The housekeeper, Margaret, would place a single plate at the head, pour me a cup of chamomile tea, and vanish without a word. I didn't ask her to stay, and she didn't ask me if I was all right. Maybe that was kindness, in its own way. On this 4th evening, I found myself drawn to the solarium at the back of the house. It smelled faintly of rosemary and aged wood. The windows overlooked a winter garden, roses left untended, ivy creeping along the stone walls, frost lacing the corners of the panes. I sat there, wrapped in a shawl my mother had knit years ago, and thought about Vermont, about her voice, thin but firm, reminding me to drink my vitamins, about the way she used to hum when folding laundry. I missed that sound more than anything. That night, I dialed her number. She didn't pick up. Too weak, probably. The nurse would call me in the morning, as always, with her chart, her mood, her favorite tea for the day. But still, I held the phone against my ear long after the beeping stopped, just for the feeling of it. The shawl slipped from my shoulder as I stood, and I startled when I turned and saw Elias standing in the doorway. He didn't say a word, just looked at me, not like a husband looks at his wife, not like a stranger either. More like a man who had stumbled into a room expecting it to be empty, and found something he wasn't sure he deserved. His eyes fell to the phone still in my hand. He said softly, "Your mother." I nodded. He stepped inside. The sound of the glass door clicking shut behind him startled me more than his voice. "I spoke to the hospital this morning," he said. "She's stable, but the doctor wants to adjust her medication." I blinked. "You called?" He looked away, almost uncomfortable. "I've been in contact with them since the beginning. I thought it would be easier if you didn't have to manage it." I didn't know what to say. I had assumed, wrongly it seemed, that the distance between us was deliberate, that he meant to keep me cold, untouched, as part of this contract. But here he was, informed, involved, and never once asking for recognition. "Thank you," I said quietly. He didn't nod, didn't smile, just stood there, hands in his pockets, eyes unreadable. I wondered if he even knew how to accept gratitude anymore. I also had a heater brought in for the solarium, he added. Margaret said you come here every evening. I looked around. I hadn't noticed it before. Small, discreet, but yes. The air wasn't nearly as cold as the glass walls suggested. I like the quiet, I murmured. I do too, he said, but it gets loud in here sometimes, without sound. That surprised me. We stood in silence again, but it wasn't heavy. Not this time. I'm sorry, I said suddenly. He raised an eyebrow. I know you didn't choose this marriage. Not really. I'm sure it's inconvenient. A long pause. Then Elias stepped closer. Not threatening, just present. I don't do things I don't choose, he said. Even when they're inconvenient. My breath caught. He looked at me. Not past me, not through me, but at me. For the first time. And in that look, I saw something that felt like pain, but older. Not raw, but healed over so many times it had turned into something colder, something hard to name. He left without another word. But the next morning, when I came down for breakfast, there was a bowl of soup waiting instead of eggs. Chicken broth with thyme. Exactly what I used to make when my mother was sick. I didn't tell anyone that I'd been running a slight fever the night before. Later that afternoon, I wandered into the West Wing, which I had avoided until then. A quiet, shadowed corridor lined with oil paintings of people I didn't know. I stopped at one in particular. A young man, darker hair, softer face than Elias. But the resemblance was there. He wore a navy uniform and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I didn't need a plaque to know who it was. His brother. The one who had died. The air shifted behind me. I thought they'd removed that. Elias's voice came low, behind my shoulder. I'm glad they didn't, I said, turning slowly. He nodded once, then walked away. But before he disappeared down the hall, he said, just loud enough to hear, he would have liked you. And I stood there a long time after, staring at the man in the painting, wondering how much of this life I had married into was still haunted by the ones who never left. The weather turned colder that week. Not in temperature exactly, but in the way the air settled heavier on the windows, as if the house knew something I didn't yet. I found my mother's voice in my head more often, not just her words, but her silences too. The way she used to stir soup without speaking when something hurt. The way she'd linger over old photographs as if the memory inside them might crack open. I had promised myself I wouldn't bring her stress. But worry is a thread you can't unwind once it's tied around the heart. So that morning, I went to the hospital. Alone. I told Margaret I needed fresh air. I didn't ask for Elias's driver. I took the train. The nurse recognized me instantly. My mother was asleep, a woolen blanket tucked up to her chin. Her face, though thinner, still held the softness I had leaned against all my life. There was a letter on the table beside her, unopened. My name written on the envelope in her hand. Hesitated before picking it up. It wasn't dated, but I recognized the handwriting, more careful than usual, as though her hands had started to fail her, but she was determined to write anyway. My darling Clara, if you ever read this, it means I'm too tired to explain aloud. And maybe I'm afraid you'll look at your father differently. But you deserve the truth. Years ago, your father invested in a venture he didn't fully understand. He trusted people he shouldn't have. One of them was Elias's older brother, James. When things went wrong, your father didn't step forward. He let the story be rewritten, and Elias took the fall to protect his brother's legacy, and ours. I never forgave your father for that silence. And, I think, Elias never forgave himself for surviving it. We owed them more than words. You're not here to pay a debt. But somehow, in marrying Elias, you may be the only one who can return what was taken. Not money, not reputation, but peace. My hands trembled, not from shock, but from the weight of recognition. All these months, I'd been angry at Elias for being cold, for keeping his distance. And yet, he was the only one who had stepped forward when everything collapsed. He had absorbed the blow that should have destroyed my father, and he had done it without demanding anything, not even truth. I left the hospital just before dusk, the letter burning in my coat pocket. Back at Montgrove, the house was lit for evening. I found Elias in the study, a place I rarely entered. The fire was low. He was seated at the window, not reading, just watching the sky disappear into night. He didn't look up when I stepped in. I sat across from him, the envelope still in my lap. "I visited my mother today," I said, voice calm. "She's doing better." He nodded slightly, and she left me a letter. Now he turned. His eyes found mine. Not guarded, not cold, just tired. "I know what my father did," I said. Silence. "I know what he didn't do," I added. That struck deeper. Elias blinked, just once, but it was enough to see the fracture. "I'm sorry," I whispered. For all the years no one said it. He leaned back, exhaled like something had been pressing on his lungs for a decade. "You didn't. Only that, but I needed to say it." The fire crackled between us. I watched the glow dance on his face, highlighting the angles that had once seemed carved in stone. Now they looked human, worn. "I used to think strength was about holding things in," he said quietly. "But silence, it doesn't heal. It just delays the wound." I set the letter on the table between us. "My mother said I wasn't here to pay a debt," I told him. "But that maybe I was here to return something else." His voice softened. "What?" "Peace." We sat there in the hush of a room neither of us had fully entered before now. The flames whispered like old friends, and outside, the wind carried the dry rustle of leaves. At some point, Elias rose and walked to the mantel. He picked up a small box, mahogany, worn at the edges. "This was James's," he said, handing it to me. Inside were two things: a pair of cufflinks, simple, silver, unremarkable, and a letter, unsent. "To my father." Elias said nothing as I read. It wasn't angry. It was regretful. I wish I had listened more. I wish I had stepped back when I saw the cliff, but I didn't. And now, Elias is paying for all of it. If I don't come back from this, please help him forgive me. My throat tightened. I looked up, and in that moment, I saw Elias for who he truly was. Not the man in the newspapers, not the groom who hadn't touched me, but a son still carrying the weight of a brother he couldn't save, and a future he'd never asked for. "I don't know how to fix any of this," I said quietly. "You don't have to," he replied. "Just stay." I didn't move, didn't reach for him. But in the quiet of that study, I stayed. And for the first time, I felt him stay with me too. Love didn't come with grand gestures. It came in the way Elias refilled the kettle when he thought I wasn't looking. The way he paused when passing by the solarium, his gaze lingering on the shawl I always left, folded neatly on the chair. The way he started to leave the study door ajar when he read at night. A silent invitation I hadn't the courage to accept. Yet, it wasn't romantic, not in the usual sense. But it was steady, growing, like ivy. And somehow, that made it feel more real than anything I'd ever known. My mother took a turn that week. The call came in the early hours. The nurse said there was a complication with her lungs. Nothing critical, yet. But she was weaker than before. I didn't wake Elias. just threw on my coat and slipped into the chilled air, the city's hum still half asleep. When I reached the hospital, she was already sitting up, fragile but awake. "I knew you'd come," she whispered, her voice more breath than sound. I sat beside her bed and took her hand. "You scared me." "I scare myself sometimes." She smiled faintly. "I still feel young in my head, but my body keeps reminding me it's not a fair fight." She was tired, but her eyes were clear. "I wanted to ask you something," I said softly. "Do you regret not telling me the truth earlier? About Dad, about Elias?" She was quiet for a long time. Then, "I don't know. Maybe. But I needed you to love freely, Clara. Not because of guilt or family shame. Just because your heart wanted to." I nodded, swallowing hard. "I think it does," I whispered. She smiled again, a little brighter this time. "I see it in you. The way you say his name." I hadn't realized I had. When I returned to Montgrove, the house felt warmer. Subtle things. A second teacup beside the kettle. A soft scarf draped over the reading chair, not mine, but placed like an offering. That evening, I gathered my courage and walked into the study where Elias sat reading. He looked up, not surprised, not startled, as if he had been expecting me. I sat across from him, not speaking, just watching the fire. Minutes passed like that. Then he asked, "Do you want to talk about it?" I shook my head. So we didn't. And somehow, that was enough. The next day, I found Margaret in the kitchen, setting out her usual quiet breakfast, prep tea, toast. Clementine slices arranged with a precision I had come to appreciate. "I'd like to make something today," I said. She raised her eyebrows but stepped back. I rolled up my sleeves and started chopping herbs. Ginger, lemongrass, mint. The way my mother used to do when someone had a cough. I wasn't sure if Elias was sick. But I needed to do something with my hands. Something that wasn't just waiting. The house smelled different when I cooked. Not the cold polish of money, but warmth. Lived in, human. Elias didn't comment when I brought the tea to his study. He took it with a nod and a faint, "Thank you." But later that afternoon, I found a note slipped beneath my door. It reminded me of your mother's soup, from last winter. I had a cup of it when I visited her. She didn't know I was there. My breath caught. I hadn't known he had gone to see her in person. I went to the kitchen and found Margaret wiping down the counter. "You knew?" I asked. She hesitated, then nodded. "He went during the snowstorm, last year. Didn't say a word, just sat by her door for a few hours. Left a scarf with a note. My heart ached with something I didn't have a name for. I thought he didn't even know she was sick back then," I said. "Oh, he knew," she said quietly. "He just didn't want to ask permission to care." That night, I couldn't sleep. I stood at the window, watching the trees bow to the wind. Somewhere across the house, I imagined Elias sitting alone. Maybe reading. Maybe thinking about James. Or my father. Or both. So I did something I hadn't done since the day we were married. I knocked on his door. He opened it faster than I expected, like he'd been standing just behind it. I didn't step inside. I didn't say anything. I just looked up at him and whispered, "You were never cold. I just didn't know how to feel warmth like yours." His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes did. And then, slowly, he held out his hand, not pulling me, not leading, just offering. I took it. We sat in silence, his hand in mine. The wind outside pressing against the windows like a quiet witness. And for the first time since our wedding day, I felt like a wife. Not because I belonged to him, but because, in that silence, I had chosen to stay. It was the kind of autumn that didn't rustle, The wind had gone still. The trees stood like old men watching the sky. Leaves fell straight to the ground, one by one, as if even gravity had softened. I started baking in the mornings. It was something my mother used to do when the world felt too loud. Flour on her hands, cinnamon in the air, a silence between breaths that made even grief sit still. Elias never asked for anything, but by the third day, I found him in the kitchen. He didn't speak, just stood in the doorway while I rolled out dough with the wooden pin she had left me in her will. "What are you making?" he asked after a long while. "Apple tart," I said. "My mother's recipe." "Was she a good cook?" I smiled. "Not exactly, but she believed warmth mattered more than flavor." He walked over to the counter, picked up an apple slice I'd set aside, and bit into it. She was right. It was the first time I heard him compliment anything. We began to share mornings. He'd read the paper at the table while I measured spices. Sometimes we'd trade headlines, never politics, always human stories. A girl who had rescued a stray dog, a violinist who played for hospice patients. He didn't offer opinions, just listened. One morning I noticed he started making the tea himself. Ginger, mint, just the way I had once made it for him. We didn't say much, but in the quiet, something steady was forming. Not passion, not tension, companionship. The garden had begun to bloom again, out of season. One afternoon, I found Elias pulling weeds with his sleeves rolled up, his hands covered in soil. "You're doing it wrong," I said gently, kneeling beside him. "You're pulling too close to the base. The roots won't come up." He looked at me, then laughed. A low, surprised sound like something breaking loose. "I built a multi-billion-dollar company," he said, "and I can't even pull a weed." I smiled. "Turns out the earth has different rules." He handed me the trowel. "Teach me," and I did. We spent the afternoons tending to the rose bushes and pruning ivy that had grown too wild. I brought out tea. He brought out old stories. He told me about James, how he used to skip rocks across the lake, and always lost count, how he once crashed Elias's first car trying to impress a girl. He was reckless, Elias said, but he had a heart bigger than his judgment. I told him about my father, the way he used to whistle when he worked with wood, how he once carved a toy horse for me from a broken chair leg. We never talked about the scandal, or the guilt, or the silence that followed, just the people they were before it all. And maybe that was enough. That evening, Elias surprised me. "I want to show you something," he said after dinner. He led me through a narrow hall I hadn't explored yet. At the end was a small room, barely more than a closet, lined with shelves. Each shelf held a box, neatly labeled, numbered. Inside, swatches of fabric, journals, photographs. "This was my mother's," he said. "She documented everything, every season, every memory. She said if we don't collect the ordinary, we'll forget what life felt like." I stepped inside, running my hand along a leather-bound notebook. "Do you ever add to it?" I asked. "Not since she died. May I?" He looked at me, surprised, then nodded. So I took one of the blank books, and that night, I wrote, October 18th, apple tart. Elias pulled weeds and laughed for the first time. The wind didn't blow, but something in me moved. The next morning, we had tea in the garden. No words, just steam rising between us, the sound of a single leaf landing on stone. I used to think marriage was suffocating, Elias said suddenly. I looked at him. "But this doesn't feel like a cage," he added. "It feels like..." Exhaling, I said nothing, but my hand found his on the bench, and I didn't let go. Later, as I cleaned the kitchen, I found an envelope tucked behind the spice rack. My name was on it. Inside was a recipe card, my mother's handwriting. At the bottom, she'd added a note. For when you're ready to make a home, not just a house. Apples are best in autumn. And love, my dear, doesn't always arrive with wind. Sometimes it just shows up quietly and stays. I leaned against the counter and let myself cry, not because I was sad, but because for the first time since this began, I wasn't afraid to be still, and still be loved. Somewhere between late October and early November, the house began to feel less like marble and more like wood. Warmer, quieter, in the way homes are when they're no longer waiting for someone to come back. I didn't knock on Elias's study door anymore. I just entered. He never looked surprised. He'd glance up from his book, nod once, then shift slightly in his chair to make space for me by the fire. We rarely spoke during those evenings, but I noticed his shoulders eased the longer we sat, as though silence, once his shield, had become a kind of shelter we shared. One night, as the wind picked up and pine needles scratched gently against the windows, he closed his book and said, "There's something I'd like you to see." He led me down a hallway I hadn't entered before. No lights, only the flickering of firelight behind us as we moved. The air smelled faintly of cedar and dust, like a room long sealed but never forgotten. At the end was a door, not grand, not ornate, just oak and brass, worn by time. Elias unlocked it without hesitation. Inside, the room was small, square, and lined with shelves. The kind you'd see in a library or an attic. But each shelf was filled with boxes. Leather, wood, cardboard, stacked, neatly and labeled in careful script. "Your archives?" I asked softly. "My brother's," he said. I froze. He moved past me, brushing dust from a lid as gently as one might wipe the forehead of the dead. "He kept everything," Elias said. Letters, receipts, drafts of apologies he never sent, poems he never showed anyone. He was always writing, but never mailing. He pulled one box down and placed it on a low table between us. "This one's mine," he added. Letters I wrote after he died. None of them sent, not to anyone. He sat, and slowly opened the box. Inside were envelopes, hundreds of them, all addressed to the same person. James. The top one was dated just a few months ago. Elias took it out and handed it to me. "Dear James, I finally found someone who doesn't look at me like I'm supposed to fix the world. She's quiet, but she listens like she means it. I don't know if I love her, but I think I could, if I let myself. And maybe that's what scares me most." I looked up. He wasn't watching me. His gaze was on the fire, eyes steady but distant. "I used to think grieving was something you did in public, at funerals, in speeches," he said. "But I've spent years grieving behind locked doors, writing to someone who'd never answer." I placed the letter back in the box gently. "Do you still write?" I asked. "Only when I feel something I don't know how to carry." There was a pause. Then he reached into the box and pulled out a blank envelope. He slid it across the table. "Would you write one?" he asked. "Not to him. To anyone. Anything you never said." I hesitated. But then I picked up the pen and wrote, "Dear Dad, I wish you had said you were sorry. Not because I needed to forgive you, but because I think you needed to forgive yourself. I think Elias forgave you long before I did. Maybe because he understood what silence can cost. I don't carry your shame anymore. I carry the women who survived you. And somehow, that feels heavier. But also, worth it." When I was done, I placed the letter in the envelope and set it beside his. He didn't ask what I had written. He just nodded once, as if he understood more in my silence than my words could say. Before we left the room, he opened a drawer beneath the shelves. Inside was a small leather notebook, worn, curved from years of being carried in a coat pocket. "This was James's," he said. The last thing he wrote in before He didn't finish the sentence. He handed it to me. There were only a few pages filled. Most were quotes, fragments of songs, or lines he liked from books. But on the last page, in darker ink, James had written, "If I die before I become better than I am, let someone else live softer because I lived it all." I read it 3 times, then very gently closed the book. "I think he'd be proud of you," I said. Elias didn't answer, but when I looked up, his eyes were glassy, not broken, just full. Later that night, I placed my letter on my nightstand, next to the photograph of my mother and me. The envelope was unsealed, because some things didn't need to be mailed. They just needed to be said. The wind returned the next morning, not, Anne, with violence, but with song. It moved through the trees like something coming back to life. And in the kitchen, Elias made tea. My recipe. Exactly as I'd once shown him. We sat by the window, watching the trees sway gently, not speaking, but somehow saying everything. Some debts aren't paid with money. They're paid in quiet decisions, in things surrendered without fanfare, in reputations risked, names untied from power, hands released from thrones they once clenched like lifelines. Elias never told me what he planned to do that morning. He just looked at me as I tied my scarf and said, "Would you come with me?" The town car took us into the city. No music, no briefing. Just the muted hum of traffic and the stillness of a man preparing to let go of something he'd built his life around. The boardroom was on the 43rd floor. Glass walls, polished wood. The kind of space designed to impress and intimidate in equal measure. The directors were already seated when we walked in. Some familiar faces, others I'd only seen in the pages of business magazines. Every eye turned toward Elias, then flicked toward me. He didn't sit. He stood at the head of the table, one hand resting lightly on the wood. The silence that followed wasn't uneasy. It was expectant. "I won't take long," he said. "This isn't a performance, and it's not a resignation." A few brows lifted. Elias looked over the room once, then continued. "I've built this company from the ground up. Many of you were here when it started. Others joined along the way. But somewhere in that journey, I became more symbol than man, more myth than partner. I stopped speaking. And when I did, you stopped asking questions." There was a ripple of movement, shoulders shifting, eyes narrowing. I carry a name tied to things I never corrected, to men I never defended. I've watched good people suffer because I refused to clarify a story I didn't write, but benefited from. He paused. Beside me, my fingers tightened on the chair rail. I'm not resigning. I'm stepping back. Handing day-to-day operations to someone who has earned your trust without needing to cast a shadow first. Because what this company needs now isn't control, it's conscience. There was a long silence. Then one of the older board members spoke. "Elias, no one asked for this." "I know," he said. "That's why it matters." He turned to me then, not the room, not the windows, but me, and said, with the calm of a man finally released, "It's time to stop leading by silence." We left through the back elevator. Outside, the wind cut through the gray like a blade. I reached for his hand instinctively. He took mine without hesitation. "I should feel small," he said, voice low, "but I don't. I feel clean." I looked up at him. "Because it wasn't loss. It was choice." He nodded. "I spent so long believing that power was something you held until it broke you," he added. "But maybe power is what you give away so it doesn't break anyone else." I pressed my shoulder against his arm. We stood like that on the sidewalk for a moment, quiet, unbothered by the world hurrying past. "You didn't have to do that for me," I said. "I didn't." I looked at him. "I did it for James, for my mother, for the boy I used to be, and for the man I'm trying to become." He paused. "But you're the reason I knew it was time." Back at Montgrove, the fire was already lit. Margaret had made soup. chicken, lemon, rice, and left it on the stove. I carried 2 bowls to the table, while Elias lit the small candelabra I hadn't seen used before. The light flickered across his face in soft waves. We didn't speak over dinner. We didn't need to, because something had shifted. He was no longer the man who walked away from the world to survive it. He was someone walking toward something, even if he didn't know what it was yet. And I was no longer just a wife by name. I was witness. Later that evening, I returned to the room of letters. I opened a drawer James had labeled "Unwritten Apologies." Inside were scraps of paper, some no more than lines. I should have said I was sorry sooner. I thought time would do the talking for me. If silence were a virtue, I'd be a saint by now. I added a note of my own, on paper torn from my journal. We forgive the ones we love by living differently than they did, and by saying the words they couldn't. I folded it and placed it gently inside, not to replace his grief, but to honor it. That night, as Elias and I stood at the upstairs window watching the trees sway under the moonlight, he whispered, "I never thought I'd have someone to come home to after telling the truth." I turned to him. "I'm not here because you did the right thing," I said. "I'm here because you chose to." He looked at me like I'd handed him something he thought was lost. Then, without ceremony, he placed his hand over my heart and said as simply as anyone ever could, "You are the only thing I've ever chosen without fear." And for the first time since we met, I believed him. The wind came back on a Tuesday, not with a storm, not with warning, just a slow, rolling hush through the trees, a nudge at the curtains, a murmur across the lake, as if the world had taken a long breath and was finally exhaling. I stood at the kitchen window with a mug of chamomile tea in my hands, watching the last of the golden leaves loosen and fall like small farewells, each one spinning softly to the earth, never forced, just ready. Behind me, Elias was setting the table. He'd started doing that more, without being asked. He always set 2 plates, 2 cups, and folded the napkins carefully, like the way he folded his thoughts. Slow, deliberate, respectful. "Did you sleep?" he asked gently. "I did," I said, turning to face him. He smiled, just a little. There was a peace in our mornings now. Not perfection, but something far better. Ease. After breakfast, we walked through the garden. The rose bushes had faded for the year, but the rosemary still held on, stubborn in the chill. Elias rubbed a sprig between his fingers and brought it to my nose. "It smells like the day you moved into the solarium," he said. "You remember that?" "I remember everything now," he replied. We didn't say much more. We just walked. And in the quiet, I realized something I hadn't noticed before. I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop anymore. I wasn't guarding myself. I wasn't afraid of love that stayed. Later that day, I returned to my sewing room. It had once been a guest bedroom, but Elias had it cleared for me a few weeks ago. Repainted the walls, installed proper lighting, even found my mother's old wooden work table in storage, brought all the way from Vermont without telling me. I hadn't sewn in months. But now, with the wind tapping gently at the window panes, my hands moved almost without thought. I stitched a small satchel of fabric, nothing fancy. Just soft linen. Inside, I tucked 3 things. A rosemary sprig of folded letter from the room of unwritten apologies. A photo of my mother holding my hand when I was 5. When Elias came upstairs later that afternoon, I handed it to him. He turned it over in his hands, like something sacred. "What's this?" he asked. "A home," I said. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. That evening, we lit the fire early. The house flickered with soft light. Candles, lamplight, warmth in every corner that had once echoed with stillness. Margaret brought out a pot of coffee and placed it between us without a word. We were her family now. Or maybe we had always been, and just needed time to see it. As we sipped, Elias reached under the table and brought out a small wooden box. "This was supposed to be yours the day we married," he said. "But I wasn't ready to give it to you yet." He opened the lid and revealed a bundle of letters tied with blue ribbon. Dozens of them, handwritten. Each one dated, each one labeled, "To my wife." I blinked. "I started writing them before we met," he said. "When I knew the wedding would happen. I thought, if I couldn't give you love, I could at least give you the truth." My throat tightened as I picked one up. It was dated 6 weeks before the wedding. "You don't know me yet, but I know you're out there somewhere, scared. So am I. I'm about to marry someone I don't love, for reasons I don't fully understand. But maybe we'll find something worth staying for. I hope we do. If not, I hope you leave, and take your peace with you." I didn't cry. I just closed the letter, placed it back in the box, and leaned forward to kiss his temple. "I stayed," I said. "I know," he whispered. "That's what changed everything." Later that night, as we lay in bed beneath thick blankets and warm light, Elias reached for my hand under the covers. "Can I ask you something?" he murmured. "Anything." "Do you believe in second lives? Not after death, but after disappointment." I turned toward him. "I think we live many lives in the span of one," I said. "And sometimes the best one begins after we stop trying so hard to protect the wrong version of ourselves." He nodded. Then, a quiet smile. "I wrote you a new letter today," he added. "The first one I didn't address to a stranger." I smiled back. "I wrote one too, for our daughter." He froze slightly. "You're—" I nodded. His eyes filled with something I hadn't seen before. Not fear, not even joy. Wonder. Then he whispered, not as a man stunned, but as one made whole. "She'll never have to earn my love." I reached for his hand. And with the wind whistling gently outside the window, we lay still. Not because the story was over, but because we'd finally arrived at the part where peace begins. If this story touched you in any way, don't forget to give it a like. It helps more than you know. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this one, filled with heart, quiet strength, and second chances, hit that subscribe button and join us for the next chapter. Thank you for listening.